who would be like 80 and no, he's not. Like, no,
He's
I've never
really,
heard it. It's like,
he's
who's the guy?
brilliant. He's
Cliff?
work. Check
Is
him
it
out.
Cliff
He's
Richard
brilliant.
that never made it to the US? Like, no one in the US knows who Cliff Richard is.
Oh,
Oh,
I
that's
do.
fine. Don't worry about that.
They're like,
That's
oh,
not
that's like, he's like Elvis. And we're like,
no,
Oh,
no, I know who he is. Yep. I lived in Miami. I know them all.
we should just
I,
talk about
I
this
got a
for the next
sign
hour.
saying something had been put on different apps, but I've got nothing that said this is being recorded yet, has it?
Oh,
Oh, I
We are
did.
live. Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this discussion entitled Imagination Matters. My name's Mary Jane Holmes, the moderator for this panel today, and apologies for I'm in the middle of a head cold, quite serious one. So if my voice only goes husky, or I turn off my microphone, it's because I'm probably coughing or blowing my nose. So apologies for that. However, I'm still very keen to chat with our panel of accomplished flash writers about their thoughts on the role of imagination in the creative process. So first, I'm going to introduce everybody, and they've garnered so many awards for creative brilliance that it would take me the hour we have to basically to list them all. So I'll keep it as brief as possible. So we have Joni Rees, many accolades under her belt. One that I was particularly drawn to was her winning story of the 15th Glass Woman Prize, called Simulacra, which I think ties into our theme today, because Simulacra talks about how humans consider image making not as representation of the real, but a reality or hyper reality in its own right. We have Michael Chizniewski, I hope I got that right,
oh, yeah, wow, that's
who
great.
who always delivers such great stories with these eclectic characters, which you can see instantly from the titles of his collections, including The Amnesiac in the Maze 2022 or 2023.
Three,
Two.
three.
Braddock three. Braddock Avenue Books. And you can tell instantly from his titles: The Alien Assimilates, The Hemophiliac Engages, The Glass Eater, The Daredevil Discovers His Doppelganger, this sort of the use of imagination and invention. Sarah Hills, again, author of the award-winning Flash collection, The Evolution of Birds, which is combines the surreal and the unexpected, the blurring of humanity and the avian. Tracy Slaughter, again with a string of accolades to her name, whose use of vignette, the fragment, can take us to the brutal, the beautiful, takes us to earthquakes and unsettling aftermaths. And Tanya Hirschman, who has recently been the driving force between the Fuel Flash anthology. All proceeds go to fuel poverty charities, just saying. And I came across a quote by Marjorie Salona reviewing your first collection, My Mother Was an Upright Piano. And given our theme today, I couldn't put it better. She said, the writer Alasdair Gray once described himself as a maker of imagined objects. It strikes me that Tanya Hirschman needs a more artful descriptor than writer too. Brilliant, mysterious, not of this earth. So we're going to be talking a little bit of not of this earth and about imagination, and imagination matters, whatever that, wherever that leads us. And imagination, as we know, is generally seen as a way that humans form new ideas, images, or concepts of external objects that are not immediately present to the senses. Thus, they're not based in reality. And so for us writers, this, of course, can be seen as the wellspring of the creative process. And writing is an exercise in imagination, a journey into the realm of possibility where anything is conceivable and nothing is off limits. And all of these writers have certainly pushed and expanded the realms of possibilities. I wanted to open with a quote from one of Michael's stories called The Atheist Reconsiders. The aliens themselves don't change his mind. A lot of people find God the day the spaceships arrive, but not our hero. If anything, their arrival proves he's been right all along. A certain smugness sets in, self-affirmation, several I told you so speeches forming in his head, the exact list of who he's going to call. And Sarah has a line from A Cock Among the Bathers. Tomorrow at the Tate Modern, while she's studying Cézanne's Bathers, Jake will take off his pants. So here we have these wonderful, inventive scenarios. So firstly, what I want to ask you all about is this tension between the real and the imagined, and how your stories are invented. Scientific research has shown that our brains process visual information from real events differently from how we process imagined events. The real apparently goes from the bottom of our brain up, but how we process imagined events, they flow down from like a big concept and then transform into smaller elements such as image. So a question that I want to ask is, what comes more naturally to you? Do you begin with the big concept, the context, the real event, a real person, and then allow the imagination to then assert pressure on that? Or do you start with something imagined, which then contributes to making sense of our reality? So I'm going to ask Michael first, as I quoted your wonderful lines there first. What do you think, Michael?
I wonder how that's tied into the John Gardner concept of the vivid and continuous dream, where the notion that a writer, what you want is to put your reader into this state where they have separated themselves from their world and their body, and they are completely lost in what they're reading. I think that's probably somewhat connected, or at least how I've understood things, because that happens to me. When I read something that I enjoy that makes me use my imagination, I don't really remember like reading and turning the pages, and I don't feel as if I'm sitting somewhere and reading a book. I feel like I'm in the world of the story, and then the story ends, and I'm like, oh, right, I'm Michael, and I'm not in that world. I am reading a thing on paper. Okay. I think that's probably, I mean, if I can get my readers to do that, that's what I kind of shoot for. Now, that's not what I don't sit down and when I start a story, when I have a blank document, I'm not like, well, how can I get people in that vivid and continuous dream? It's like, probably what I would do to best summarize it is I try to find people who are interesting, who do or believe interesting things, and make them do things they don't want to do or believe things they don't want to believe. And I think that's where conflict comes from. And I think that's where my stories come from, is like, come up with some quirky person who does something kind of weird and interesting that you don't read about every day, and make them do the opposite of what they want to do.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then, of course, you use a lot of archetypes, don't you? So you have sort of the ventriloquist, the nihilist, the atheist, so that you can sort of perhaps generalize in some ways in the smaller form.
That book let me just do that, like kind of take those titles of those types of characters and do it. So it's probably easiest in that book project, because my other books and my current work, I don't do that. I don't use like archetype names as my character names, but like in that book I do. Most of those characters never even get a real name. So
yeah.
But yeah, even when I write real stories about like people with names and stuff, it's like, okay, this person does this. What do they not want to do? Because they've become, I imagine them as becoming way too comfortable in what they've been doing. And they need to be shaken out of that.
Great, thanks, Michael. Sarah, also yours was the second quote that I looked at, and you also, blur these sort of certainly in The Evolution of Birds, we have this sort of strange cacophony of different things going on there. So what do you start with, an image, or do you start with an idea that you're trying, or both? I mean, as writers, it's always difficult when somebody says, how do you do it? But
Right. Yeah, it is. It is. I think I actually do both, and it depends on what I'm writing. So if I'm writing a piece of CNF, I'll start with a concept, right? Like that's what you have this idea, like, oh, there's that one time, I'm going to write about the time I got my hand slammed in the door and my dad went berserk with the gun, and then you go, oh yes, but then what did my fingers look like? And then you go and you sort of scan the environment, right? But when I'm writing fiction, I think I just take random things and put them together, and I'm like, oh, well, what will this do? What will that do? Um, I have a story in Smokelong, Hey Lisa, I Hope You Like, that started with, actually, it started with a mood. And that's not really a concept, is it? It's just like, well, I had this song, Bob Marley song, stuck in my head, and two characters who I thought might be intimate together, but that's not really an idea. So I started saying, well,
it's a,
what kind of objects?
also it's a little bit like what Michael was saying, that sort of smushing two things together and saying where the conflict comes from.
No, not at all, actually. I think what I do, and it's weird because we don't really think about how we're going to write a story. It just sort of, there's a little bit of magic and there's a little bit of, randomness, right? And I think what I do, it's weird, I scan the environment that I've put characters in and say, well, what is this? And then I find the meaning and find the sort of the narrative that way. So it's like a little treasure hunt, I guess.
Oh, yes, that sounds nice. A treasure hunt. Tracy, what about you? Are you sort of starting off with an image, or do you have some sort of theme that you're going for?
It's usually always an image for me, or sometimes a setting, but it's very much a setting with kind of images that are supercharged within it. I was really fascinated when you sent through, that little description of, how your brain is actually processing things, and you've got these kind of electrical currents going in different directions, because it often feels like that for me, that you've got two opposing forces. That for me, it's often memory and imagination, or something that you see and perceive in the current environment that incites some kind of unconscious force or recollection or memory within. And those two kind of forces often do feel like they're flowing from different directions, and then they ignite in the image. It's that image that kind of draws both of those things together. But I've been exploring writing more creative nonfiction, as Sarah was saying, sorry. And so I've been very aware of the shift between what happens when I'm writing a fictional story and what happens when I'm sitting down to, tell the real story. And so it's been, but it's still the image that is that kind of central atomic structure that pulls me in. Yeah.
So the project Why Your Hair Is Long and Your Story Short, is that creative nonfiction, or is that?
Yeah, it is. But so it's I don't even know what to call it, really, a personal story. I think maybe I'll have a volume of personal stories rather than personal essays. I mean, some of them would fit the essay mold. Others would be so far at the end of the story continuum, they, you know, feel more like short stories, but they are me writing the reel as far as I can trace it.
Because there you have, you know, the line, because you grow up in your mother's salon where every mirror holds a story wet haired. There's this sort of mixing together of it's the mirror that's holding the wet haired story rather than the person in some way. So there's this sort of image that's being subverted there.
I love that. I love that idea. Yeah, that was literally just me. That salon again is a good example of a setting that really was so huge in my, you know, young years, growing up in a hair salon. And I was, you know, pulled, but there was a certain big story that took place there that I tried to go back to, but I couldn't get down for quite some time. And then it was actually really allowing that story just to fragment into these tiny erratic glimpses in a really, really hyper fragmented form that gave me the pathway into it. And yeah, it really did connect me with how my storytelling, I think, did grow in that space of, like, you know, the door would chime, another customer would enter, another woman sat down, and I was, you know, often watching my mother, you know, section the hair and seeing all the cutting of the story on the surface, but I was also seeing what was unsaid in that face on the, you know, the screen of the mirror. Like, so there was the tension between what could be shared and talked about and said. And, you know, often there were some fascinating stories that the women chatted about, but there was also this kind of real emanation of all the things that women weren't saying in the same space. Yeah. So it's that tension, I think, between, yeah, fiction and imagination that is always present for me. And like I say, just kind of tends to explode in an image. Yeah.
And comes from image. Yeah. Tanya, again, many people forgot he was a Russian spy. So we've you know, I don't know how many Russian spies you know, obviously. So I'm assuming there is this sort of tension between the reality and the imagined here, and what happens with that for you.
Well, firstly, it's lovely to be here with all of you, and it's so nice to hear how other people come at it and come to writing. I'm not in any writing groups anymore, and so I don't get to have these conversations. So this is just lovely. Generally, what happens with me, and it sounds a bit different from what we've talked about so far, and I was trying to make some notes which I can't read, that I don't start with either an image or an idea, but I get the voice, and it comes to me and it says something to me, and it can be either the voice of the character or the voice of the narrator. And so the one that you quoted, which is so many people, I've had to print this out so I remember, and that first line, many people forgot he was a Russian spy. It's like when I get that in my head, I know who that is. I hear that narrator, and I thought that's what. And it for me, it feels like with flash fiction, especially, I kind of then there's a sort of flinging at the page where for me, thinking too much doesn't help me do the kinds of writing I want to write, and I have to get out of my own way and short circuit the thinking brain, and just let that voice take me. And I was realizing I've been doing this for nearly 30 years now. And it's basically me writing for myself and creating all these imaginary friends. And I can see some of you nodding that we're not alone here. And I love them all, and I miss them. And it's like Flash, there may be friends you spend slightly less time with. So that it for me, it's so much, it comes to me as the voice. And if I can't hear them, I don't think I would carry on writing. So I don't know what that says about what my brain does, but I suspect my brain just goes like this. I'm not sure there are straight lines going up or down in my brain.
Sideways as well, and
Yeah.
yeah. And Joni, yes. what's your relationship between the sort of the invented and reality? The line I have from you is, "I was 30 when I left to bring that harlot Helen home."
That's one in a series I've been working on. That's Odysseus talking. And he's really angry because he's been gone for 20 years and he didn't intend to do that. And so he's having a, conversation as he's walking down the dusty road. But I like to invade my characters' personas. I like to put them on and imagine myself as them. And what would they do and what would they say? A lot of times I'll take things straight from the news and I will write a piece of flash based on that. But, you start with reality, but then you work your way into fantasy. And, the higher order, the imagination, the higher order thinking is usually the way it starts, but then it trickles down to all those details into the lower order thinking, like you said, the parietal to the occipital. And it's really interesting because it's almost like this overarching umbrella, the idea, but then the idea sorts itself out into its separate puzzle pieces, if you will.
Yeah, puzzle pieces.
And also I started out as a poet. And so to me, every word is extremely expensive. So I'm really careful with word choice. And a lot of my flash fiction sounds a lot more like poetry than it does flash fiction, because I'm more concerned about the music of the language and how it sings when you read aloud. So, it's kind of interesting to me to make sure that the piece is interesting as a piece of flash fiction, but it's also singing to you.
And like poetry with flash, as you will all know, we've got to use other things than just the words because it's so small. I mean, it's so small. So the sound, the pacing, the spaces, what we allow the reader to make that narrative leap, as we would do in poetry. We're using a lot more devices to immerse ourselves, as Michael said, to immerse ourselves in this world for this brief moment, as we do in poetry. So I think there's a great link between those two genres. Yeah.
I think you can't take flash fiction away from poetry or poetry away from flash fiction. It's that condensed and concentrated. You have to care about every single word.
Yeah. I mean, then we could go into the idea of prose poetry, but that's for another panel, I think. So, okay. So, so we have this, it seems to me that we have very much reality leading imagination, sort of almost subverting the real in some way, or taking it off into these, nothing's off limits. We can take it wherever we want, which can be quite difficult, I think, in the short genre, because you might want to take it way off. But I have another question for you, and Tanya, I'm thinking of your recent story, The President Issues a Non-Binding Resolution, which is such a great title, where the female president, spoiler, transforms into something winged. I'm going to say nothing more. And Lewis Carroll said, imagination is the only weapon in the war against reality. Does that, given that theme, does that chime with your own creative praxis as a writer in general and a flash fiction writer in the context of the contemporary world?
Are you asking me first?
Yes, I'll ask you
with the
first.
president.
Yeah. Yes.
I think, I would say it goes for me so far beyond just being, well, I can't really extricate being a writer from being a human being living in the world. And I think that this is I pretty much am in this dream state that Michael was talking about. I think I'm in it as much of the time as I can get away with as possible. I think it's definitely a survival strategy. And I suspect, you know, telling stories is a human survival strategy. So I think this for me is part of it. And it's always been with me with flash fiction, well, with short stories, with everything, poetry, nonfiction, I'm telling myself the stories, and it's generally me grappling with a thing and trying to turn it around and look at it, which I think is why I notice that I tend to love having narrators who are watching a person do a thing. And so I'm not always in my characters' heads, but maybe that's just the ones I've been looking at recently. And the president one came because I watch a lot of television, and I'm not ashamed to say that anymore. I watch huge amounts, and I think it's research. And I must have rewatched The West Wing, and then I watched that one about the female president with Tia Leone. Can't remember what that was, and it's obviously a lot of binge watching. And I suddenly thought to myself, an American president is never alone. And I love being alone, and I spend most of my time alone. And I suddenly felt, what might it be like if you're the president and you're never allowed to be alone? And that's how that story started, is imagining this president, and could she find a way to be alone? And for me, there's never been a point where I stop myself if it's about to get very weird and surreal. And I don't know how that has happened, but it's always been there. I do suspect, and I don't want to take up too much time, but we have been talking about science. I studied physics as an undergrad. And looking back now, I think it was studying quantum physics and relativity when you're 18, 19. I think it totally changed my idea of what we think of as actually reality. And it's like magic, quantum physics, and it's full of stories about things we can't see. And I think that started me on this path where I feel free to make up anything. And I am totally never constrained by what we think is reality, because actually we don't see how how bloody weird reality actually is. So for me, what happens in that story with the president, that's just natural what happens. And I won't give it a spoiler. But also, could I just say I was very proud of my title, and I was just like, yes. But it
And of
only
course,
came because I've been
titles,
binge watching. Yeah,
but titles
I've been
are
binge
so
watching
important in
President.
Flash.
Oh my God, they are. And you know when you get the right one, and it just feels so good. So thank you for mentioning that.
Um, uh, Sarah, I read an interview where you said as children, we're inventing our own mythologies to make sense of the confusion and hurt of the world. So is that something also in terms of what Lewis Carroll is saying? You know, this idea that imagination is our protection against reality.
Yeah, definitely. And I think not just as children, but even now we're using it as an escape. There's so much that's pulling our attention, right? And so it's nice to have this it's nice to have this sort of world you can go into and be in control of, and sort out the rules of, and explore alternate realities. And I think one of the great things though is that it's a way, because we're building these worlds, we're kind of developing a shared community with people who also need this escape, right? This sense of understanding. And so I think that's a great thing that we can do. We're lucky if we can create a shared humanity with people through our stories.
Yes, and this idea, it's not just escape, but making sense of our own emotional response to the environment within which we're living. It's not always escape, because I mean many of your work, and also and particularly Tracy and Joni as well, they're quite dark and quite quite heavy hitting, weighty subjects. So it's also it does seem to me that your work is it's not just a weapon against reality, but it's a grappling with it rather than, I mean, Lewis Carroll said it's a weapon. I don't know if I would actually use that word. But Michael, your work, I mean, sometimes it's very, very funny and yet very dark at the same time. So we had this, that line, my safe word, by the way, is porcupine. I'm kidding. I mean, I'm not kidding, because my safe word is porcupine. And through that story, I think you repeat that, that your safe word is, or the narrator's safe word is porcupine. And it has this strange mix of reality and dark humor, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, that story went in a direction because like I had that idea because that seems like a really ridiculous safe word, and then of course there's just all those images that go with it. So that was fun. Like once I had that line, I did want to repeat it as much. But that's in a book that I'm kind of like shopping now that's about fathers and sons. So like I wanted that story. I don't think that's going to be in that book. It'll be in a different book later, but like I tie that story to like the guy, the narrator who says that. He like talks about his dad's safe word and how like when he had to talk when he was with his dad when he was this kid, his dad was like telling him about safe words and telling him what like the safe word was between him and his mom. And it's like, so that was a lot of fun because it's like that's not, I don't think, part of the usual talk, quote unquote, that you get with your dad about sex is like, oh, and by the way, you need a safe word in case things get too rough, son. I know you're 12 and you probably don't know what I mean, but you will. And then like I don't think like in any way like the dad would be like, and by the way, like when me and mom are at it, here's our safe word. And like so the just because I was trying to like shoehorn that story into a collection with a motif, it kind of went in a direction. So there's a few stories I have that become about fathers that probably didn't need to be about fathers in any way. But then that's one of those serendipitous things where it's like, well, no, that's kind of funny though. Because I mean, that's like the worst day of any boy's life, like without question, is the day that like some parent corners him and is like, hey, let's have a talk. And it's like, you really want to rip your skin off and run to the moon, like on that day. And so to make it even worse is like weird. So yeah, like I didn't want some stories to be about that, but then so yeah, so that's where the darkness comes out. It's kind of funny, but it's also like, why am I reading a story about this? Like this is weird. Like you mentioned a story in the one book called The Daredevil Discovers His Doppelganger, and there's like a traveling daredevil doing a show. Like he does his daredevil show at like the local amphitheater or the local whatever, and he finds out that he goes to this little town and his doppelganger in the world just happens to be this like pretty hardcore like sex offender like guy that lives in town. So like he's there trying to promote himself like, hey, I'm going to jump over like the ring of fire, but he also happens to look exactly like the local pedophile. So he kind of has to deal with that. So it's kind of like, I think that's where like it's like, hey, this is kind of funny, but then I'm like, oh wait, this is awful, and it's the thing I was talking about. Like, let's put someone in a situation they don't want to be in, and it's like a showman having to like realize, like, wonder why every person in the town is booing him and throwing things at him and trying to like, do things to him, and then he realizes it because at the end of that story, spoiler, he runs into that guy in a restroom, like bathroom, like at a restaurant. So he has to face that, but. Anyway, so yeah, I don't think I intend for that to happen. But then, like when I think of something like that, it's like, oh, okay, that's better than like that not happening. So I should make that happen.
And of course, we never know really. I mean, I don't think we know, do we? How we finish stories, that comes from what the. I mean, some people, I think, who is it? Amy Hempel, for example, always started with an end line to a story and works towards that. I don't think I've ever been that organized. Everyone's shaking their head saying, nope, that's not what I do. I've tried it. But that's something that I've yeah, far more chaotic. Tracy, I mean, talking about reality, your stories are quite based in reality. Like if there is no shelter, for example, I mean, it's a very real thing that's happened. How does imagination, how does the imagination, apart from sort of inventing the characters, play into where you went, for example, with that story and the aftermaths and those characters?
Yeah, I mean that is a piece that is very fictional. Obviously, you know, there was a horrific earthquake in our country, and you know, a lot of years went by before I felt that I could approach a story set within any earthquake. But I think the thing that fascinated me or drew me in, that haunted me, and you know, I wanted to explore was, you know, what you do after an emergency, what the process of living on in the aftermath, you know, literally aftershocks going on, you know, those waves that are rippling out. And I was just so struck by the strength of survivors, and I think there was a certain way in which my own kind of experience of PTSD wanted to explore that kind of living on after, you know, such a devastation, living on within the wreckage and picking things up piece by piece. So there was, you know, it was a very fictional work, but there was definitely an inner connection, a kind of connection from within. And I think in terms of that relationship between reality and fiction, certainly now that I have started to turn so much more towards telling the real, I can see how fiction absolutely has, I don't know about a weapon, maybe a shield. It's been something that's allowed me to talk about things that have felt unspeakable, you know, by that process of telling the truth, but telling it slant. I very much see fiction as like the shield that you use to look at Medusa. Do you know what I mean? You can't always stare at that thing down in the dark face on. You have to kind of guard yourself and look at the reflection first. And I think, I mean, I wasn't aware of it at the time. I just thought I was writing fiction, but I know my Medusa was waiting there in the dark all that time. Probably waiting for me to put down my shield, which I think I'm getting to. But sometimes I have to pick it back up again. Like I've had a long stretch of writing personal essays, personal stories, and then, you know, found it was getting too harrowing and suddenly kind of rebounded into fiction and found an immense relief actually going back and being allowed to pick my shield up again. And yeah, so there is definitely, I think, that interplay between fiction and reality, and all of the skills, I suppose, the craft that I learned writing fiction, I think, was just kind of armoring up, gearing up to go down into the real, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. William Wordsworth says that he considered the imagination as an awful power that rises from the mind's abyss.
Wow, that's brilliant.
So that's a little bit, you know, a little bit like, you know, that idea of the harrowing. And talking of the harrowing, I mean, Joni's short story, the Simulacra, which I mentioned earlier, is, I mean, that's no war against reality there. We're sort of head on with what's happening in that story. Do you want to explain a little bit about that story?
It's kind of interesting. I wrote it a long time ago, but it's very prescient. At the moment, it's
Yeah.
pretty appropriate. You know, it's about the final woman who is free and on her own, and how they capture her and do things to her, and she ends up teaching girls how to behave and how to do what they're supposed to do. And um it's not really positive. I mean, it doesn't turn out well. But it's what I felt in reality. Joan Didion says we tell ourselves stories in order to live. And a lot of times the things that I write about are things that are very troubling to me, but you can't walk around and tell people all day long all the bad things. So you just sort of take those bad things and you turn them into fiction, or you turn them into a poem, so that you can live. You know, you can do other things. You can go out and pet the cat. You can go make coffee. You can go in the garden. It's a way of sort of catharsis, if you will, of all the things going on in the world. You have to examine them. You have to try and get a handle on them. I don't think we ever will, completely, but it's a way of writing it out and then go on. It's a way to go on.
And that sort of leads me to, you know, this quote by Sylvia Plath that says that everything in life is writable about if you have the outgoing guts to do it and the imagination to improvise. And, you know, all of you have broached some really difficult subjects: trauma, abuse, suicide, cancer, infidelity, just odd, quirky things as well. Do you do you think generally that the flash form does something that other genres can't do to articulate such themes? Joni, I'll start with you.
I think it can, because it's so condensed, but it's also really tricky to be able to make that personal and universal. And in flash fiction, you only have, you know, and I prefer to write maybe 10 sentences or 20 at the most, because I just like to distill it down into its essence. And somebody who does that extremely well is Nancy Stolman. I don't know if you're familiar with her work.
Yes, yes,
but you know, she'll be going one place, and then you realize she's gone to an entirely different place. But you can say, "Oh yeah, I thought that. Oh, I felt that before. I know that." And you know, you didn't expect it, but it's now universal. Now it's something that is you, as well as her story. It's your story too. And so I think Flash can do that. And it's, you know, Poe used to say you should only be able to read something that's written in one sitting. That was his idea. You know, you can't go for days and read things. They should be short enough that you can read them in one sitting. And, you know, I agree with that as far as flash fiction goes. And it holds worlds in such a short little span, and it's not easy to do. I have to say, I'm not that good at it. I'm still learning how to do it better. But, you know, when you read these people that are absolute geniuses, like Meg Pokras, who's not with us today.
Oh, she should have been. She should have been.
Yeah, she was going to, but she couldn't.
Yeah.
But anyway, you know, it's just amazing to me how people can say so much with so little. It's an art. It's a true art and a craft.
And Tracy, you're so good at getting such a lot of sort of this the beautiful and the brutal into such short pieces. Is it something about Flash that that draws you to doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I really think Flash is how my brain works. When I write, I don't get, a nice linear pathway. I get this kind of detonation where a whole lot of pieces just kind of I love Tanya's idea of just the flinging, like a whole lot of, like fragments just fly into the light for me. And I have to kind of then pick them out and decide how they're going to go down. But sometimes the answer is to, don't even order them, just let them shower the page and see where they fall. But I definitely think, especially now exploring memory, that flash and fragmentation is something that's just grown from my nerve endings. It's the way that I was shaped, and I think it's a really powerful mode to navigate writing trauma, because there is often that sense in which you can only, tiptoe toward the abyss and just dip a toe in, and then you got to get the hell out again. So, if you allow yourself to just write the shards, or, to pick the pieces up from the rubble the way that my heroine does in the earthquake story, and just sit with that fragment and not stress yourself to have the whole linear narrative carved in stone from A to B, because A, that's too painful, and B, it's often not the way that you were ever able to record a memory that's so wrapped in pain or trauma. So yeah, I do see it again as a form that is really opens up a way to speak, often to really kind of unspeakable subjects. So I've found it really, really freeing. And often when things fly into a million bits, it will be because there is that, pressure point. And it's not a story that I can necessarily face head on. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And there's this idea, isn't there, that your reader has to become an active participant in this as well. So they fill in the gaps, I think. And they do the work, which is something interesting about Flash and poetry as well, that they're doing a bit more of the work. Sarah, what are your thoughts on this idea about, because you also write a lot about quite dark.
I do, yeah, and I love what Tanya said. You have to write down the hurt so you can live. Oh no, Joni said that, sorry. But yeah, no, I mean you have to make yourself vulnerable if you in I think flash fiction allows you to do that in a safe way, because you aren't putting all of it in, right? But also yeah, I think because it's a small container, you don't have to do, you don't have to share too much of trauma, so people can actually take it in. I think when you give too much of a story, it's too much for the reader, it's too much for you. I also think that the experimentation of Flash really allows you to go at dark subjects in a new way, right? You can use a found form to tell a story about, rape or suicide or whatever. And I think that's it's a really clever way to do it, that sort of, or absurdity that sort of lifts it, elevates it a little bit. And I think that allows it to be something that readers can accept more, I think. Does that make sense? And then I think through the gaps of flash fiction, like there's so many gaps in flash fiction. There's so much that you don't need to say. And sometimes not saying is so much more powerful than saying. And I don't know that you can do that in a novel. right? You kind of have to say in a novel, whereas in Flash, you know, we have these gaps, we have this beautiful thing. So I think that, you know, a lot can be said without being said.
Yes. So this idea of the ineffable, this idea of what is not being said, Michael, I mean, there's a lot of your work as well, and thinking about the fragment. I mean, I think there's one story which actually is quite funny. The vegetarians eat the vegans, or something. Is that the title?
Right.
In 5 scenarios.
Yeah, I think how Flash and how I function, and thinking about what all these other brilliant people have said here, and I think they're all right. I think one thing that happens when I write Flash is because you have fewer words, and somebody said that, you know, words are very expensive and you can't just throw them around. Is that what I try to write is when I use a single sentence and a short sentence at that to describe something, I think I'm trying to get at more of a truth there. Like that's a more definitive statement when you're trying to describe a character or a situation or anything in 9 words instead of 280 like in a paragraph in a novel. Like that 9 words is going to feel more like some kind of profundity that you're trying to express. Like this is this. Like you're not letting people figure that out. You're not leading up to it. You're declaring it. And I think that's probably like I have a lot of sentences where I try to do that in my Flash, where I'm like, yeah, I'm not beating around the bush. This is what you should be thinking, audience, because I only got about 6 words to express this. So no debate, because I need to go on to the next sentence and the next concept and move things along here. So I think that's what Flash does, is it maybe like forces me to do exactly that, is to express profound things in small doses so they feel, maybe even if they aren't true, they feel true. So somebody's reading and they're like, oh, okay, well, yeah, that's what I should be thinking here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time debating it.
Yeah, yeah. So following on for that, Tanya, this idea of outgoing guts that Sylvia Plath talks about, that you can write about anything, you've got to have the outgoing guts, which is what Michael's saying. It's like, I've got to talk about this and I've got to do it now. What's your thoughts on that idea?
Well, you've all said already so many wise things, and I'm just sitting here nodding. But yeah, I don't really know about the guts part. I think what someone was saying, I think it was Tracy, that with flash fiction, we can sort of stand at one remove from some very difficult experiences. And so I think that helps the writer for a start. That helps us, and maybe it helps us to know, or it's helped me to know, I don't have to stay in that place for very long. We can like get in, get out quick. Was that Raymond Carver?
Yeah.
And also that idea, and I say this when I teach, is that it's not what you can't put in a flash fiction, it's what you're allowed not to have to put in, which I love. So it's permission to leave out so much. And the idea that a flash piece will resonate for so much longer than it takes to read it. I'm not quite sure how I'm tying all this in together, but and also just the idea as well of using the surreal and the absurd to deal with, and I think several of you were saying as well, using surreal and absurd to deal with really dark subjects, that can make them easier for us to write and easier for a reader to take in. And the joy of Flash for me, and you've all got me really excited about it again, and I'm so regretting that I'm 70 pages into a novel and I wish it was a Flash story, but anyway, is that you can do surreal, you can do absurd, and you don't have to explain anything. And you're allowed not to explain. You can just have the president. I can't remember what the president does at the end of my story. She possibly flies off. I think it's ambiguous, but you can just do it and you don't explain, and you don't have to, and that you've got permission. Because how can you possibly explain anything in 500 words, 200 words, 100 words? I couldn't, no. So, I'm just not going to.
So it takes me to very quickly, because we haven't got very much time to, and I know Tanya, you wanted Einstein in here. If you want your children to be intelligent, read them fairy tales. Folklorists often prefer the word wonder tale to define the fairy tale, and given that so many of your stories embody a sense of wonder, however dark or surreal, do you think that Flash is the perfect genre as the wonder tale in our contemporary world, as we don't read fairy tales that much? This can be a sort of very quick yes or no answer, really. I'll start with Tracy.
Oh gosh. I think there's a real a link for me with fairy tales, because the fairy tales are so dark. Like, I often think that when I get, that very common, oh, your work is so dark. I'm like, but you'll sit down and read your children the darkest stories ever. So I remember Snow White's heart, or that the heart being meant to become home in the casket, and and the real story of Cinderella with those shoes full of carved off pieces of the stepsister's feet. So and also I was talking to a group of women lately about myths, and how there are so many of them are rape stories, and we were little girls just consuming rape narratives under the kind of archway of this kind of long ago. So I think there's a really interesting fusion, or still a power that flash fiction holds, that stretches its roots back to the darkness of those original tales.
Doni.
Well, I don't even know how to talk about that. Yes and no. I think that I wouldn't liken flash fiction necessarily to fairy tales. I agree with Tracy in the darkness, for sure, because we have the original Grimms, and I read them when I was a teenager and realized how awful they really were. It could be in that some flash fiction has that kind of twisty ending that some fairy tales have, and then some of it is they lived happily ever after. So it could, but I don't know. I think flash fiction is more important than that. I'm not sure exactly how to articulate that. I think it's a form that is growing, and I think it will, the more our kids have attention deficit disorder, because it's easy to read a flash piece in one sitting, and you can get the whole thing, and it's great. But I think it's more complicated. It's harder to do, because you don't necessarily have to have a straightforward story. Like Hemingway's iceberg theory, he actually wrote a piece of flash called The Quay at Smyrna. I don't know if anybody's ever read that. It's only one page, but it's really interesting, because one of the exercises we had when I was in my graduate program was to write what happened after this story. And everybody came up with something entirely different of what went on in the next hour or so after this story ended. And it's kind of fascinating in that flash fiction should be able to have other people make leaps of thought and ideas. It doesn't have to mean what you want it to mean. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
It means something else to somebody else. It's like the Stanley Fish reader response theory. Once you write that thing, it's gone. It's out of your hands. Whoever is going to react to it, that's their reaction, and it's their story now. And then the next person may react differently, and it's their story now. It no longer belongs to you. And so, you know, we may have had an idea of this is what this story means and this is what I'm going to do, but it's not yours anymore when you send it out into the world. And I guess that's fairy tale like in its own way, because you can interpret it any way you want to, really.
Thanks, Joni. I think we're going to run over, and I have strict instructions not to run over. So I think the conclusion would be, if you want your children to be intelligent, read them flash fiction. Should be the sort of closing off of this discussion. Thank you so much, Joni, Michael, Tanya, Sarah, and Tracy, for being part of this discussion, giving us so much interesting points, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. I've definitely enjoyed it. And well, happy Flash Fiction Festival in New Zealand from all these different places that we're zooming in from. And I wish you a very good day, a very good night, a very good morning from wherever you are. And yes, I think we've finished.
Thank you.
So-
Thanks for having me.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank
you.
you.
It's nice to
Lovely.
meet everyone.
Wonderful. Yes.
Great to meet